This is a message to you, our most loyal listeners. Beginning in 2025, we will be offering special Tel Aviv Review episodes, usually with a stronger connection to the current news cycle, episodes that are exclusive to Patreon subscribers. Without the ongoing support of our patrons, many of whom really have been with us for months and years, we simply would not be able to sustain the podcast. All patrons will have access to these special episodes, and they can be set up to show directly in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The first patron-exclusive episode will be a recording of a live event that we had in Tel Aviv in December, featuring the award-winning British journalist Rachel Sharby, who discussed her newly published book, Off-White, The Truth About Anti-Semitism. Support the show by becoming a patron at Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review, all in one word. Thank you very much. And now to the show.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Berda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. Our guest today is a professor of law at Reichman University, formerly IDC at Herzliya. He specializes in constitutional law and administrative law, and his research has recently focused on the history of censorship and the freedom of speech in Israel. Professor Adam Shinar, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we want to ask you about two aspects of your work regarding censorship and your analysis of the ways that police militarization lies at the core of authoritarian shifts. But let's start with censorship, because last November, Israelis were amazed to discover that the Film and Theatre Review Board still exists, when it banned the release of a documentary film about 1948 because it had not approved it. Now, this was at the behest of the government, specifically Culture Minister Miki Zohar, because the board's approval had long ceased to be a prerequisite for film releases. Now, I want to ask you whether we were wrong to assume that the Film and Theatre Review Board was a dead letter.
Well, no, it's not a dead letter, actually. So first of all, the Film and Theatre Review Board, it's not actually called the Film and Theatre Review Board anymore, because only the film, because theater censorship ceased in Israel in 1991. It was a result of several Supreme Court decisions that we might want to get into later. But basically, the board existed since 1927. It's a British legacy from the British Mandate, and in 1948, when Israel was established, Israel incorporated all British legislation into modern Israel, so there wouldn't be any vacuum, and including the Theatre and Film Review Board. And that has been functioning ever since, and basically what it requires is that every film, and back then every theater play, needed the pre-approval of the board in order to be screened. And that has not been a dead letter, because every movie in Israel today that is lined up for commercial screening has to receive the review of the board. Now, basically today is just a rubber stamp in the sense that it virtually approves everything. The last time that a film was banned and not approved was actually 2002, Muhammad Bakri's Jenin. What happened in November, which you mentioned in 1948, is not that it banned it, but it said to the various, I think it was the Tel Aviv Cinematheque or other places, you cannot screen it before we approve it. And then there was a hearing, and then what they did is they classified the age.
Was it the first time that a film was screened without the approval of the board?
No, the film was screened in the past. Now, it's a lot of what the board does is not really etched in law, but kind of custom or convention. So it had an exception Although the exception was never written anywhere, but it had an exception as part of its ongoing practice that if the film is screened in festivals, for example, then it does not have to have their approval. Because what happened is that the producers or distributors have to pay a fee for the board to consider the film, and the fee is somewhat expensive. It's about 1,000 shekels. So if it's just a one-time screening in a festival, it's not worth it. And so the movie was screened on occasion without receiving. But what happened now was there was a sort of a rallying cry of right-wing organizations that this film is historically inaccurate, or that it disparages IDF soldiers, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, they harnessed Miki Zohar, and he demanded, that the film be received the approval. Of course, he never watched the film. He said this film contains, disturbing scenes, false narratives, whatever. But he never saw the film, and he admitted to never seeing the film.
But why did we think then that the review board was a dead letter? Because if we go back to, say, Jenin with Muhammad Bakri, even that banning did not go through, right?
Right. It did not go through because Bakri petitioned the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, and the High Court of Justice overruled the board's decision. So in a way, it's not a dead letter in the sense that the board still exists and it still is staffed by real people, members who go through the films and approve them. It's a dead letter in the sense that, or at least we thought it was, is that it rubber stamps everything.
What's interesting is because we are going through what some would call an authoritarian shift, it's basically using kind of old colonial laws to actually advance the goals of the contemporary government.
Right. And what's interesting is that they're actually the same goals. See, the British so the motivation is the same, but of course they use it for different ends. So the British use the censorship regime like any other country uses censorship regime. So for example, for moralistic concerns like, nudity or pornography or things, or, maintaining public morality. But the British also used it for political reasons because they were concerned about tensions between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, and they wanted to maintain law and order. So images that were too Zionist, for example, that discussed immigration to Israel by Jews or the establishment of new towns and villages by Jews were frowned upon and sometimes were prohibited. Now, when the Jews took control of Palestine and established Israel, they maintained the same legal architecture. Of course, they didn't use it to suppress Zionist themes and messages, but they used it to suppress themes and messages that were not in line with whatever the Zionists believed was in the best interest of Israel. So, for example, Arab films or things that had to do with the occupation after 1967, banning of German, banning of Yiddish, things that sort of interrupted the national project of establishing Hebrew as a national language, and various things. So they kept it in place, but they use it for their own political ends.
Yeah, it's interesting to review the historical development of that debate, and also in line with the whole debate of freedom of speech, because when we consider the history of the review board, it's often in opposition to an increasingly liberal Supreme Court, right? Because there was a string of rulings that struck down the banning orders of the review board, and that was also mentioned in order to say how public debate in Israel has become more and more liberal, with Jenin being the bookend of that process. Now, what you claim in your work is that this is perhaps a slightly romanticized version of the development of freedom of speech in Israel. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so actually, when I started designing my constitutional law class, I thought about what cases should I teach the students. And of course, one of the topics was free speech. And I looked at other syllabi of other professors just to get it, inspired, or just to see that I wasn't missing anything. And all the big free speech decisions, except for one that is very famous called Kol Ha'am, Voice of the People from 1953, but that's kind of an anomaly, started around 1980s, 1990s. That's when they started. So the liberal shift that you talk about is a shift. It started in the 1980s for various reasons. First of all, it had to do with the appointment of two very influential Supreme Court judges. One is Meir Shamgar, the other one is Aaron Barak, both later the Supreme Court presidents. And they brought a more liberal spirit. Barak was also partly trained trained in the U.S. and he absorbed First Amendment values, and they really changed. So the doctrine. So what's important to remember in this context is that actually from 1948 up until the late 70s, early 80s, the Supreme Court was completely deferential to the board, to the censorship, right? So most of the decisions back then, you can't even, it's funny because you can't even find them. I had to find them. They were never published in the databases. They were never published in the official rulings of the Supreme Court. I found them in the Israeli archives, filed in the same file as the name of the movie or the name of the theater, right? And there were these brief 2-3 page decisions saying, look, the board is a representative body, right? So it's interesting, we might want to talk about how the board was composed, but it's composed of public officials and public representatives. This is what they thought people should see or not see. There's no reason for us to intervene, even if we think differently, because that's the board that has the authority. Not even that. During those decades, the Supreme Court never even bothered to watch the film that was censored. It just completely trusted the board. So actually...
So there were petitions, and that was in response to petitions.
Of course there were petitions. First of all, not a lot of petitions, because people knew the Supreme Court would back the board, so what's the point of... But, every now and then, there would be a petition. But then every now and then the court said, look, that's just the way it is. And I don't see any administrative flaw on which I have grounds to intervene in their decision. And the whole idea of free speech, even though it was articulated in this 1953 decision, was completely neglected by the court in subsequent years. It almost forgot about the case where it decided that free speech is paramount. It remembered the case, the 1953 case. It revived it only when Aaron Barak came back on the court in the 80s, and then it became this celebrated, widely cited case. But between 1953 and the early 1980s, it was cited about 7 or 8 times.
Yeah, the Kol Ha'am case, we should mention that it was with regard to a newspaper, right? About the press. Can you tell us about this, the film board in relation to other forms of censorship in the country, censorship on the press, the military censorship, and other forms of it? So
it's really interesting, this question, because what this brings to mind is, why didn't this 1953 decision that talked about the press, why didn't it spill over?
Maybe we should say what was it in a couple of sentences.
So the 1953 case called Kol Ha'am, or Voice of the People, had to do with the Minister of Interior shutting down 2 communist newspapers, one in Hebrew, one in Arabic. One is called Kol Ha'am, the other is called El Ittihad. And the reason that he shut it down for 10 and 15 days, respectively, is because they published an op-ed. And the op-ed was critical of the supposed plan, which actually turned out to be false, but whatever. But the supposed plan of Israel helping the U.S. by sending troops to help the U.S. in its war in Korea, helping the South Koreans fight the communist North. And the communist newspapers, of course, were aghast at this plan. And they said, look, if you want to sacrifice, don't sacrifice Israeli blood, you can go and, you Ben Gurion or you Abba Ibn, you go and fight yourself. And the Minister of Interior was sort of shocked at this. Today we would think about this as like a benign op-ed, but back then it was scandalous. And he shut down the papers. The papers petitioned the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, look, freedom of speech...
He had the right in law to do that, by the way.
To petition the court.
Yes,
and he had the right in law, by the way, because of a British ordinance from 1933 called the Press Ordinance that was actually only repealed recently, a few years ago. And the court said, look, we're a democratic country. Nowhere does it say we have free speech, but we determine we have free speech because you can't have a democracy without free speech. And therefore, you, Minister of Interior, have to exercise your authority with regard to free speech. So you can't just close the paper willy-nilly, only if there's sort of a near certainty, almost certainty that this would cause a breach of the peace. Can you? But these are just op-eds. No breach of the peace will occur, and therefore you cannot close down the papers. Okay. Now, what happened? So this was one way to regulate newspapers. This goes back to your question from the British. Now, the British had other pieces of legislation called the Defense Ordinances that I'm sure Yael knows a lot about because she's written about them from 1945, which were also incorporated into Israel when Israel was established. Now, again, the irony. During the Yishuv, when there were Jews in Palestine before Israel, the Jewish leadership was extremely critical of these defense regulations, emergency regulations, because, for example, they restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine. And
Right. They call them the most draconian laws in the world.
which they were very draconian.
They compare them to Nuremberg laws, to Nazi laws.
Yeah. And then you would think, well, now that you have independence and now that you're in charge, surely you would repeal these draconian Nazi Nuremberg laws. Turns out, no. Well, they found that these laws were actually very useful for their political maneuvers in Israel. So they kept them. They just didn't really, either they targeted now against Arabs, or in the beginning they targeted against the undergrounds, Lehi and Etzel, the right-wing revisionists that were threatening Mapai, or Haganah, or Tzahal, or whatever. So under these regulations, they established a military censorship, which still exists today, which also requires that every piece of news that has to do with security, I'm simplifying for brevity, has to be submitted to the censorship for approval. And this is the reason why, even today, and you'd think this is crazy in any other Western liberal country or even non-Western liberal country, you have representatives of the military censorship sitting in the newsrooms in channel 11 or 12 and 13, and they go over the news of the day and deciding what should be aired and what should be not aired. And newspapers have a similar obligation to send it. And during just this past war, this Iron Swords War, which may or may not be over, the military censorship has acted over 600 times to limit the publishing of whatever. We don't even know what limited, right? Because it's censored, but it's very, very active, and it's active because of this British law. So we have the press, we have the news, and what happened with the board is that it's not this type of security-based censorship like you do. But ironically, this is why the court became was more deferential for the board. See, in Kol Ha'am and in a few other cases, the court said, well, when these are issues of public concern, when you're reporting the news, citizens have a right to know what's going on in the world. If they don't know what to think. And if they don't know what to think, they don't know what to vote. And you can't have that. But art was considered different. You don't really need art. It's not as important. And because art is not important, we're going to let the board do whatever it wants. And it laughs, but this was actually the reasoning. So, for example, when you showed newsreels before movies in Israel, you used to show, brief newsreels, Yomanei Karmel Herzliya, they were called.
Before TV was
right. People came to see the movie, and before the main feature, there was a 5-10 minute whatever clip of what happened, and this is how people consumed visual news. The Supreme Court was actually pretty adamant that free speech attaches to these newsreels. Why? Because even though they're shown in movie houses, they're newsreels. But for the main feature, that's, free speech is not as important. And what's really interesting is that the Supreme Court extended this to documentaries as well. So even when you have documentaries, and for example, even as late as 1978 and 1979, there was this documentary called Palestine and Israel, or Battle Over the Land, Ma'avak al Karka or Palestine b'Israel, as it was called. And this was a documentary film about land expropriations of Arabs by Israel in the 1950s. It was a documentary. And the board said, no, this is full of falsehoods. It incites Arabs against Israel. It maybe even incites Jews against Israel, because Jews will see what the country has done on their behalf. And the Supreme Court says, I don't care about free speech. They didn't even think about free speech. They didn't even think about this Kol Ha'am decision. It treated it like a type of movie, even though it was a documentary. And it said, no, this film is full of falsehoods and its insights. And that was enough for the court. And this is as late as 1978, 79. And that decision in particular was authored by a judge called Moshe Landau, who was the same judge who actually accepted a petition against the board when it came to newsreels. So when it came to newsreels, he was okay. No, we should maintain free speech. But when it came to documentaries or artistic films, he said, no, the board gets to decide, basically.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk about this. I have a full disclosure. I was actually an intern at Avigdor Feldman's office, so I'm the person that wrote the petition for Janine for the Janine case. And I remember really going into the fact that documentary does not have to be balanced and two-sided and kind of all kinds of theories of film and strange things that we put in there. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, I want to go back to these shifts. So you have this period of time where it's obvious that so the court forgets it's a Kol Am decision, and then it goes back to being a liberal court in the 80s and 90s. And then now again, the use of this. How do you tell this story? What is this story of the use of this set of laws that were never really incorporated into formal law? For instance, in India, where this is also a huge issue, the issue
Right.
of British censorship laws.
But they were amended in India. In Israel, they were never amended. The only amendment that happened in Israel was it was in August of 1948. And see, what happened was when the British left, the board could not continue because the board was run by the British, even though it had Jewish, Muslim, and Christian representatives from the natives, right? But the British left. And so there was nobody to run the board. And there were 3 miraculous months in Israel between May 1948 and August 1948 when there was no artistic censorship in Israel. And somehow the country survived. But then in August 1948, and think about it, in the midst of the 1948 war, the War of Independence, this existential war, Israel decides that this is really imperative and we have to amend this. And they introduced an amendment and they subordinated this board to the new Minister of Interior. And they said, you Minister of Interior, you appoint the new members. This is the only amendment that the law underwent from 1948 until today. So we're really operating under British architecture. And what's really interesting is that other countries who've had censorship boards, similar censorship boards, or other countries who were influenced by the British, moved on. Like, so for example, in the US, there were state censorship boards, but the Supreme Court invalidated them in 1965, in this case called Friedman versus Maryland. Other countries revised their boards. Israel, for whatever reason, which is, we can speculate, but maintained. It did cancel theater for an interesting reason.
Well, yeah. What was the reasoning behind that? And why didn't they do it across the board?
I think there were 2 reasons. First of all, there were initiatives by members of parliament to do it also for films. Mordechai Virshuvsky from Meretz wanted to do it, but it never, picked up steam. Why? First of all, I think theater was perceived already as something different from film. It was perceived as more elitist. Fewer people went. It was more expensive. It was the intelligentsia. Maybe it wasn't perceived as threatening because it didn't have this power that films have. That's reason number 1. And reason number 2, which I'm speculating here, but I think it's sort of a very educated guess because it's based on some archival material, is that there was internal censorship in theaters in Israel. They had their repertoire committees and they knew what the audience wants to see and doesn't want to see. They knew what would generate money. You didn't have that filter or buffer when it came to films. You had, capitalists who wanted to make money, film distributors, and they didn't have committees. They didn't exercise all these considerations. And so they just put out there what people wanted to see. So for example, and we're slightly changing here, but audiences in Israel, even though it might sound strange, audiences in Israel loved German films in the 1950s and in the 1960s. They wanted to see films in German, so much so that films in German were the number 2 films after films in English. It was films from the US and films from Germany. Now, the board didn't like this. The Ministry of Interior didn't like this. Politicians didn't like this. But film distributors and movie house owners, they couldn't care less because they want to make money. So there was this battle, and this battle didn't really exist in the theater. And therefore, they were kind of willing to give it up. And it's actually funny, the person who spearheaded the reform over theater and literally the one who canceled censorship in theater was Aryeh Deri from Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi party. I don't
not
think
the most liberal member of parliament.
and I'm sort of guessing that probably not an avid theater goer, as well. So yeah, and we're stuck. And there were attempts, and there was a committee. There was a committee headed by Gabi Shalev, Professor Gabriela Shalev, to think about what we're going to do with film censorship. But even that committee didn't recommend repealing the board, and it wasn't adopted anyway. The recommendations, but so we're stuck with it. Yeah, we're not stuck with it because we can do away with it. But it's a convenient arrangement for a lot of people.
No, I wonder to what extent it really is different from the infamous decision, for example, to ban the Beatles from coming to Israel in the 1960s.
The Beatles were never banned. That's kind of apocryphal. It's an urban myth.
Oh, is it?
The Beatles were never banned. There were, it has... there was talk about, yes, the Beatles are coming, and the Beatles have this corrupting influence on the youth, like, I don't know, like they're Socrates or something. But in the end, there was no formal ban. What happened with the Beatles? It was probably a commercial dispute between two producers who had some sort of falling out. And then one acted against the other. I don't remember the details. But in the end, there was no formal ban.
Wasn't
it kind
like
of fell
a
through.
government report that said about something about
But there was no formal
corrupting
ban.
influence?
No, the
Okay.
government did discuss it. The members of Knesset did discuss it, but there weren't. It was discussed, but they never banned it, and they didn't have the power to ban it. In the end, it was a commercial issue, and then they were just
No, but then,
became-
I mean, looking at Israel 60 or 70 years ago, and not just Israel, actually, you also said that it was like in many other countries in the world, that there was this sense that the state had to be a lot more interventionist in terms of like public morals. Or
It wasn't that state. First of all, yes, you're right, interventionist, but there was also, it's sort of a cliche and a generalization, more of a collectivist mindset. So when members of the board banned films, they weren't always paternalistic in the sense that we know what you need to see, and therefore we're not allowing you to see what you don't need to see. They believed, some of them at least, that they were at the behest of the public, that they were representatives of the public, and therefore they're doing the public's bidding. So if they're banning a film, now actually there's a very interesting interview that one of the board chairmen, Levi Geri, gave to Ma'ariv newspaper in the 1960s. And the interviewer says, look, but, if people don't want to see a movie, they just won't go see it. They're not a captive audience. We're not forcing them to see a movie. Why are you going to intervene in the choices of adults of what they're going to see? And he said, look, you have a point. If, he said, the population of Israel was all high level, there's a word that he used, high level, then there would be no need for us, for the board. But that not everybody in Israel is high level. Some of the people here are low level. This, after all, is an immigration state, is Medinat Aliyah. So there was always also kind of racist overtones as well, because, all these Mizrahi Jews coming from Arab countries and from North Africa, they were not deemed by some of them to make the right choices. And therefore we, Ashkenazi, and I'm using Ashkenazi on purpose because the board was entirely Ashkenazi, almost entirely male, a few women, but male, and Jews, of course, no Arabs. Arabs started to come only in the late 1970s. And so it was basically Jewish Ashkenazi men.
Which was not unusual for the time.
It was not unusual because that's basically although it was unusual is that the board had a lot of people from the arts as well and from journalists as well. So it wasn't just like these bureaucrats. They had translators and editors and journalists and poets and directors. They were also members of the board as well, which is interesting to think about. These people from these creative fields. Why would they lend the reputation to be part of censorship? And I asked this, and I had this conversation about this actually with Michael Handelsetz, the theater reviewer for Haaretz, what he used to be. And he said an interesting answer, which I think is correct, is that they saw themselves as changing from within. We are there to make sure that this institution remains liberal. You should thank us, really. Some of them actually quit after they realized this was a non-starter. That's one reason. So, but I think it's interesting to see that censorship didn't really have such a bad reputation back then. It was accepted. Now, it was always controversial, but there were always big segments of the Israeli public who thought it was needed or desirable, and sometimes people from the arts themselves. I mean, Ephraim Kishon, for example, or Nathan Alterman, two very famous, a poet and a satiricist, supported censorship, for example, when it came to Germans, so it had its supporters. And these people, thought they were doing something good or thought they were helping the liberal cause. That's one thing. And I think there's also material reasons. They didn't really get paid for being members of the board. They got some money for meetings. But what they did get was free entrance to movies and plays throughout Israel. And 2 tickets, you and for your partner. So it was kind of neat. You could go into every movie in Tel Aviv. So, but anyway, at least back then, there was no negative stigma attached to being a member of the board, which is interesting because I think it reflects on what you asked me. Is like, this was accepted. This was an interventionist state. It was collectivist ideals, and therefore it wasn't really controversial for you to be on the board.
Moving to some other work that you've done that's also related, and especially it relates to the now, when we've had so many emergency laws just in the past 2 years, and the crackdown on free speech, mainly of Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, this is a big issue that was led by Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir. So this is already like 5-6 years ago, or maybe even longer. You make an important argument against police militarization, and the argument is interesting and related to the censorship work, because you say that police militarization actually looks at the communities that are being policed as enemy communities,
Right.
or it looks at
outsiders,
at the citizen as a threat,
Right.
and this is and in a way, I
Actually,
think
it compromises their citizenship status, because it views them as not full citizens. Because had they been full citizens, the reaction would not be militarized.
right. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship? I know this is kind of throwing
No,
this at
so,
you.
okay.
The relationship between the work that you're doing now on the censorship and these ideas about the relationship between policing and erosion of
So
citizenship.
it's a super interesting question, because actually I never thought about it. And I should say, first of all, my work on police militarization was done in collaboration with a colleague and a very close friend, Eliav Lieblich, who is a professor of international law at Tel Aviv University. So we were actually not even looking at Israel. I mean, we were writing this for American audiences, and we were investigating this phenomenon of police militarization, which is very, very ubiquitous in the U.S. When you have police departments, even in sort of small and medium-sized towns, purchasing tanks, tactical gear, helmets, and vests, and literally they're
Getting
buying,
trained by the IDF.
and also by the military, and they're literally buying equipment from the military. There's actually a program in place, a federal program in place called 1033, which allows them to get military surplus for, I don't know, for a reduced rate or for free or for whatever, and they're spending a lot of money on that, and they're embracing not just the equipment but also the modes of organization, the cultural norms, the ethos, and they're beginning to look more. And people have said, well, what's the problem with this? Because some people said, look, if this allows us to fight crime better, then we should welcome this, right? And so first of all, some of the people said, look, it doesn't allow you to fight crime better because it actually leads to more police violence. Once police have all these tools at their disposals, they'll make use of these tools. And we thought this argument was fine, but we thought the problem with police militarization goes much deeper, and has to do with the way we perceive police and what is the police's role. The police are part of the community, right? The NYPD logo, whether it's serve and protect or whatever. They serve the community, they protect the community, but at the same time they are part of the community. And because they're part of the community, that means that they treat you as a citizen, in terms of, for example, due process rights, right? And there's certain protocols in place because you're entitled to these rights as a citizen. Now, when the police acts like a military and one starts to think like a military, militaries do not deal with citizens, right? They sit at the border. They deal with the external enemy. The external enemy is not owed the same due process rights and the same treatment, even though it is owed some things, of course, but it's not owed the same as a domestic citizen. And it's perceived as a threat. The police do not or should not see citizens as threats. So the real risk of police militarization is starting to view citizens like you view the enemy. And what is especially concerning is that the police do this in a way that is discriminatory, because they're not being militarized to everybody. They're being militarized in the U.S. for communities of color, for example, or for people who are in poverty. And therefore, what they do when they do that, and then when they don't do that for everybody, what they really do is they exclude a group or a segment of the population from the protection of the law and from the conception of a community. And once you do that, that means you can treat them differently because they're not part of us. They're not part of the fabric of society. You can treat them like enemies. So that is a way, a real way, I think, in which your citizenship is affected. Yes, nominally you are a citizen, but your lived experience as a citizenship, your lived citizenship experience is as such as you're not really a member of the community because you're treated differently by.
Is it manifested in
the
violence?
censorship?
No, but
It could.
That's what I'm asking, because it's a question about really the monopoly on violence, and sort of like military violence is sort of legitimate, whereas police violence is something that people are critical
It legitimizes violence because you perceive people. Think about even the language that we use in order to describe criminal problems, right? The war on drugs, the war on poverty. Now, poverty and drugs are social issues; they're social problems. But when you attach the word war, what does that tell you? Well, then we should do whatever we can. We should treat this like a war. Let's bring in the tanks and bring in the choppers and whatever. So the idea of a war means that everything is, you can do everything. And I think now when I come to this was sort of a long introduction, but I think I needed it to just explain censorship, of course, is also a type of policing, right? Because it tells a person or a community, first of all, what you can or cannot produce, or what you can or cannot see, or what, and if you would generalize, what you can or cannot know. And it has always worked in that way that it targets particular communities. Now, if you want to link it to the police militarization debate and to censorship in Israel, then of course censorship against Arabs is especially pervasive, right? And even in artistic censorship it has, because, for example, it used to be the case in the 50s and 60s where Arab films were banned. Now, why were Arab films banned? So one reason...
Films from Arab countries.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Why? So one reason was, look, they're banning us. There was Arab, so we need to ban them. Okay, I think that logic can go only so far, but whatever. But there was a real demand for people to see Arab films. Now, the demand actually came from two groups. One was from Arabs, from Israeli Palestinians, and the other from Mizrahi Jews who wanted to see films in Arabic because the first generation, that's the language that they knew well. And the government and the board said no. First of all, for the Arabs, for the Israeli Palestinians, a lot of the films were deemed to be insightful. Right. So for inciting. So if the films had nationalist themes, pro Gamal Abdel Nasser themes, they would cause the Arabs to revolt against. And you used to remember, we're talking about the 50s and 60s when there was still a military government, military rule against applied to Israeli Arabs that was only lifted in 1966. And so what happened was, and you think it might be crazy, is that even when they approved films, they sometimes, the board determined where the films could be screened. So they wouldn't be screened in Arab cities, or they wouldn't be screened in mixed cities, or they would be screened in Jewish neighborhoods in mixed cities. There were these decisions about where it was screened. Now, for Israeli Arabs, for Mizrahi Jews, part of the concern was that these Jews are going to see, the boulevards of Alexandria in Egypt and start being reminiscing, and maybe thinking, oh my God, we made a bad decision coming to Israel. Look at what we left behind. Yael is laughing. But, and it would cause nostalgia, which was, because now they're stuck in this ma'abarot, in these shacks, in these horrible conditions with dripping roofs, and they would think about the houses that they had in Alexandria. And one of the board members was a social worker. Her name was Miriam Itzkovitz, and she was the head of the training of social workers for the welfare department in Israel. And she says, and in a particular moment, she says, look, if we approve this film, we board, we're undoing all the work that we social workers are doing in the ma'abarot, in these shanty towns, right? Because we're teaching them Hebrew and assimilation, and this is such a great place. And look, you're showing them all these beautiful images from Egypt, and you're undermining everything that we're doing. So it was complicated, and it was a type of policing. Now, of course, these communities were completely dispossessed of real political power, so they couldn't even, protest against this. But the board did the same thing when it came to Arabic. Even the language, they didn't want the language to thrive. So, for example, when a woman, I think her name was Dalia Eliyahu, but I might be misremembering, wrote a play in Arabic. She was a Jew who came, I think she was an Egyptian Jew who came, and she wanted to show her play, put up the play. The board said no. Why? Well, it didn't say no. It said yes. The play was in Arabic, but it said you can only show the play in the ma'abara, in the shanty town, whatever the
Transit camp.
transit camp, right? Because it didn't say this, but it was obvious. If you show it outside, people are going to start, maybe they want to, Arabic would maybe be attractive and the people would want to learn Arabic. So we have to keep Arabic limited to the transit camp. And people tried to intervene on her behalf. I have a letter from the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Moshe Toledano, who said, look, this woman, she's a poor woman. Her parents are ill. She needs to make money. This is the only way she can make money. Let her. And the board said, no, only in the transit camp and only for 2 months, the permit. You can't even do it. So even if it was it's crazy, right? But that was, back in the day, that was what happened.
All right, Professor Adam Shinar, thank you very much for coming in today and telling us all this.
You're welcome.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now, all available for download. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and now on Blue Sky as well. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.